Good morning, everyone. I'm gonna record this and try never to watch it again, and let's never speak of it, right? Um, so today we're gonna talk about World War One a little bit more, and then your little writing assignment will focus on the response to the war as well as memorialization. So I'm going to pick up where I left off. I've included a handout in the email I sent you, so you can follow along with that. That would be what was on the PowerPoint, and you can fill in your notes around that there. So we talked a little bit in the last class about how this war started, some of the reasons behind it, interlocking treaties, rising nationalism, and the desire to sort of take care of one's ethnic group in racial terms like pan-Germanism and pan-Slavism, and of course the Tsar of Russia saying that he was the king of or the czar of all Russians, right, including all Slavic peoples, even if they were being ruled by others. Um, we talked about Archduke Franz Ferdinand is shot in Sarajevo. The Russians are angry because of the crackdown by the Austro-Hungarians on Slavic peoples. They mobilize their army. This doesn't go easily or fast. And so, in the intervening time, the Austrians ask the Germans to help them. Germany attacks Belgium in hopes of circumventing the defenses in northern France, going all the way up to the English Channel and crossing down into France. But remember, they turned too quickly because France, of course, instituted Plan 17 or Plan on 17, right, and went straight for Alsace, that region that was hotly contested between the two countries. So Germany attacks Belgium and France defends itself by splitting its army in between the northern German invasion and invading into Alsace. I've given you a map of that Western Front between 1914 and 1918 there. As we talked about a little bit in the last class, this war was based on defensive tactics. That is, these trenches built by tractors and manual labor, of course, physically digging, took hours of manpower and, of course, long dedicated missions into very, very treacherous territory. We talked a little bit about the innovations of those things. How, if you'd been in the Russo-Japanese War or maybe the Crimean War, you may have seen some of it. Large artillery guns constantly shooting from one side or the other. So this was a very tough time to be a soldier. It was hard to be in the trenches. You lived your days in the trenches, and every now and then you were asked to go over the top. That's what they called it, going over the top. You climbed out of the trench and you ran through no man's land. That space between the two trenches, trying to attack the other's position, all the while getting mowed down by machine guns or tripping over barbed wire or getting exploded by the artillery fire. This was not an easy war to fight in. Not that any war is easy to fight in, but the massive amounts of casualties were unheard of at this point. So many people distrusted their commanders because, of course, generals stayed way back in the back of the lines, but up at the front, lieutenants were ordered to shoot anyone who refused to go over the top, even though death was sometimes guaranteed in those actions. Refusing that order meant death, meant your lieutenant or your captain would shoot you on the spot. And so there were people who refused, and there were mutinies. Stanley Kubrick made a movie about some of the mutinies in France during the First World War. It's called Paths of Glory. I've given you a link there in your handout to a fantastic scene of that just sort of illustrates what it would be like to go over the top there, if you can suspend your belief enough to watch Kirk Douglas be a young, not 100 and whatever years old, however old he is now, and be a French soldier. This was not the only innovation of the war, trenches and artillery. There were things like barbed wire that kept popping up, and of course, gas, chemical warfare, as we talked about, has been around for a long time. But the Germans first used chemical warfare at the Battle of Ypres in 1915 in Belgium, and the French responded, as did the British and the Americans later on. But there were also there was also sort of a new tactic of air force. Using big blimps called Zeppelins, they dropped bombs on major cities, and using small airplanes at first as reconnaissance craft. You couldn't really mount anything heavy on an airplane in 1914 through 1916-ish. They developed the engines more over time. In fact, they first couldn't think of a way to mount machine guns on airplanes, and so they just gave the pilots handguns, and the pilots shot at one another with handguns in the sky. These small craft were mostly used as reconnaissance planes. They took pictures and then you used those pictures to go back. I've also given you a map of a small portion of the trenches dug. All those red lines on that map that looks like veins, those were the thousands of miles of trenches at one battle, at the Battle of Verdun. Verdun was one of the bloodiest battles in the war, fought in 1916 over about zero gain on each side. There were 1 million casualties over the 10 months that the battle was fought. So why fight it? Well, this war was sort of a war of attrition. That is, who can bleed the most? Who has the most soldiers? Who can cut down on the amount of bloodshed quickly? And that was not easy. Changes in the way nurses responded to this crisis was a big deal. Nurses devoted their lives, and many gave them, to tend to soldiers. But tending to bullet wounds got better, especially during the Crimean War with the establishment of the Red Cross, and then carrying over into the First World War. The Battle of the Somme was basically the same concept. This battle that was fought over a very small amount of territory, but 1 million people died between the two sides. These battles represented massive problems for not only their armies, but for the people back home. They knew how many people were dying, but neither side was willing to give up. Colonial powers began sending troops from other places. At the time, a young statesman in Britain named Winston Churchill, who everybody celebrates for his leadership in World War II, but he cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of colonial soldiers because of poor planning. And it's not until World War II, it takes him nearly 30 years to get back in the good graces of the British government. He's not nearly as celebrated in places like India or Australia or New Zealand because he called these troops there and sent them to fight the Ottoman Empire in Gallipoli. It was a terrible idea, and so many of them died. they call it Anzac Day. And it's sort of celebrated like Memorial Day is here, or Armistice Day is in the UK and Europe. The Gallipoli attacks did not work. The intention was to open up another front in the Ottoman Empire so that the Ottomans could stop sending soldiers to help the Germans and Austrians and Russia and France. And so but Gallipoli failed, but eventually the Ottomans are forced to leave the war anyway. The Germans initially thought this would be a big naval war. They were planning on fighting the British on the water. The British, of course, were the premier naval power in the world. Remember the Japanese? They wanted Prussian land armies, but they wanted British navy. The Germans wanted to be the new naval power, but I don't know if you look back up at that map, there's not much in the way of access to the major the major part of the Atlantic, and so you have to go around this little bit of Denmark called Jutland. Jutland is also where Schleswig and Holstein were, if you remember those two places. Jutland, or Jutland, right, the Jut of Denmark, was really the only major naval battle. There were lots of blockades, but naval battles were mostly confined to small little instances. So all these ships that Germany built sort of fought to a draw in Jutland, and the British claimed victory there because the Germans sort of turned around and they started pouring their money and time into building U-boats, or underwater boats, right? Submarines. Submarines have been around for a long time, but they weren't super useful. Think of the Hunley in the Civil War 80 years before. That didn't work out super well, right? They still have it in a tank in Columbia, or Charleston. Where is it? I don't know. Anyway, so but the U-boats became the German secret weapon. Not so secret after they first attacked, but they would attack ships that were carrying goods. They blockaded Britain so that it couldn't get supplies from places like Canada or the United States. The United States toyed with getting involved in this war early on, in as early as 1915, when a group of U-boats sank a passenger liner that was coming over from America. Called the Lusitania. It kills Americans on board, and all those casualties. The Germans said, "Oh, that boat was carrying secret weapons to the British," and of course the British said, "Oh no, those were just regular people coming to visit Britain." By the way, they were totally smuggling weapons on that boat. That was proved later on, but that's what they denied it at the time. Back in the east, on the Russian border, the Germans were doing better than they were better than they were in France. The Russians didn't nearly have the infrastructure or the artillery power that the French did, and of course they have a much larger border, and so the French, where they were able to stop the German mobility, the Eastern Front moved much quicker into Russia. By 1917, almost all of Ukraine was under the control of Germany, and almost all of what is now Poland and those Baltic states like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were all conquered by the Germans. The problem was manyfold, and we're going to talk about this in the next class. I'm going to give you a little bit of a rundown and how it fits into the larger story of World War I now, and then we'll talk about the Russian Revolution in detail in the next class. The Russians were losing to the Germans. They didn't have well-trained army. People were not into this war. They didn't really understand why they were in it. Remember, they were in it because their czar wanted to protect some Slavs within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they weren't attacked there. And so a lot of the army didn't really understand the reasoning behind the war. There were food shortages all throughout Russia. And that was a problem because, soldiers need to eat. And so people in their villages were starving because they were sending all their food to the soldiers fighting this war that they didn't quite agree with. All of this leads to losing to the Germans. Not enough guns, not enough people, not enough artillery, and definitely not enough infrastructure to bring soldiers to where they need to be quickly. They don't have the trains that Germany had. They didn't have the roads that Germany had. And many of these people are still peasants, essentially. They're just told to pick up a gun, and they do that. Inside of Russia, there's a popular movement to institute a new constitution and socialism. There's a brief provisional government in February of 1917 before an eventual mass Bolshevik revolution led by the communists in October of 1917. We'll talk about those two events in the next class. In the end, the Bolsheviks win, and the communists take over Russia, declaring themselves a new country in which the Communist Party rules. They call themselves the USSR, basically the United Republic of Soviet States. Soviets means workers' groups, right? So talking about the communist and socialist there. They want to leave the war, and they do. They make a separate peace with Germany, abandoning France to their fate, and of course the British. That seems to be a bad thing for the French, right? All those troops that Germany was using to fight Russia in the east can now be shifted to the Western Front and fight France and Britain. In 1917, the Germans make a weird little mistake. They send a telegram to the Mexican government called the Zimmermann telegram. The Zimmermann telegram essentially says, if you attack the United States from Mexico, right, on the southern border, you can have whatever you want. We'll help you and that sort of thing. America, of course, being America, was spying on their neighbors' communications because why should anything change in 101 years? The Zimmermann telegram was intercepted, and the Americans see that there is a true threat to the American way. Before this, they had been largely hands-off. They had sent aid to France and Britain secretly, but they hadn't been as open as you might have thought with an all-out war happening for the last 3 years in Britain. American troops begin arriving in Britain in 1918, and the Allies are able to sort of turn the tide of the war. The more important than American troops was actually American money. The Americans begin lending money to both France and Britain. They're able to sort of bring over new technology and new artillery. So essentially they got re-outfitted in the middle of the war, and Germany didn't have that. Germany had been sort of using the same pots of money, using the same artillery over and over. And with this invigoration, the Germans essentially lose their steam. Now, if you look at that first map that I've given you on your handout, you'll notice that all the battles mentioned in 1918 are well inside of France. When this war ends, it ends with the Germans pretty far into France. Not as far as they will be in, say, World War II, but definitely inside of France. And that's very confusing to the German people. They say, but, I mean, if we look at the map, we're winning, right? But they're out of money, they're out of political clout, and more people are turning on them. The Ottomans are gone. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is in tatters, and so they ask for peace. And on 11/11 at 11 a.m., so on November 11th at 11 a.m. in 1918, they call for a ceasefire. That's the armistice. This is still celebrated on Armistice Day, a time of quiet, peaceful reflection. Is that Veterans Day or Memorial Day? I'm not sure. But Armistice Day is very important in Britain. It's a time of celebrating peace or remembering the loss and the destruction of war. So the question becomes, what do we do now? This is a terrible thing that has happened, but it's also very confusing as to how it ended. It ends because Germany is out of money and out of political clout. And so they force their troops to go home, many of them of which say, why? Why are we doing this? Why are we not winning this war? It looked like we were supposed to win, and then we didn't. Who stabbed us in the back? Who betrayed us? That's a question that of course, Adolf Hitler will try and answer later on. But the victorious powers decide to gather in Europe to discuss the fate of, well, Germany, Austro-Hungary, and of course the Ottoman Empire, the three sort of main enemies of the Allied powers during World War I. Prime Minister Lloyd George, Woodrow Wilson, and Premier Clemenceau of the French Republic, as well as King Orlando of Italy. He's in on the action this time, and of course the Italians want something. They want land out of this whole thing. They also want colonies. That's not going to work out super well for them, but we'll see how that plays out later on. They meet at Versailles. If you remember, Versailles is of course, sort of home of the German Empire, right? They signed the Treaty of Versailles in 1871 there, essentially establishing their power in the region over France. Versailles is a symbolic place as well as an important one for France. France wants to regain their power in Europe. The Treaty of Versailles of 1919, so now we have two, the Treaty of Versailles of 1871 and the Treaty of Versailles of 1919. There are dozens of them, I'm sorry. 1919 is the one we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, so you may want to remember this. What's in the Treaty of Versailles of 1919? Well, it's basically a laundry list of what France and Britain wants and how Germany can give that to them. They lost, and so they have to pay up. France and Britain want the disarmament of Germany. France, of course, wants Alsace and Lorraine back, which they lost in the Franco-Prussian War. They want it returned to France. They want a demilitarized zone along the border between France and Germany. So the Rhineland, the Rhine River that runs between the two countries, they want that demilitarized. They want a sort of gray area between there where there are no German troops, there are no German military holdings. The French can put up military things there, but the Germans cannot. Germany is not allowed to build any submarines under the Treaty of Versailles, not a single one. That will be important later on for the Second World War. I mentioned talking about the origins of the First World War all the way back in the Treaty of Versailles of 1871. The origins of the Second World War are the Treaty of Versailles of 1919. It is one of the major reasons that the Second World War takes place. It's also one of the major reasons of the global depression that will follow in the late 1920s and through the 1930s. Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, arrives wealthy, attached to his wealthy country and has all these big ideas there. One of the 14 points, he brought 14 things he wanted to accomplish. He wanted a lot of groups of people separated based on what he called racial lines. That, of course, led to a lot of self-determination, things like Czechoslovakia, so the Czechs and the Slovaks sort of joining together to form a country, Austrians in the Austrian place, Hungarians in their Hungarian place. All those Slavs get pushed into Yugoslavia, Yugo meaning all, Slavia obviously meaning Slavs, so Yugoslavia, all the Slavs together. Albanians, Bulgarians, Romanians, Greeks, Turkish people, that's what Wilson wants. He wants them all separated in their own states. The way he described it is very racist, right? He wants all these people sort of put together so that their inferiority doesn't infect Europe. There. These new Balkan states, like Hungary, separated from Austro-Hungary, right? So no more Austrian Empire, no more Austro-Hungarian Empire, no more Ottoman Empire. Places like Greece and Syria and Iraq are formed out of what used to be the Ottoman Empire. So two empires have completely collapsed, Austro-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. At the end of this, Germany shrinks in a lot of ways. Denmark gains some of that territory back in Schleswig and Holstein, as well as many of the little smaller French places that they gained. The British and the French also decide to split up the Middle East based on what they call the Mandate system. And Woodrow Wilson supported this as well. The Mandate system is essentially a colonialism light. It's like diet colonialism. The British and the French would send advisors to these places like Iraq and Transjordan and Palestine, which were the British holdings. You can see them on that map I've given you way down there. There, of course, Arabia is still being ruled by the Saudi family since it declared its independence from the Ottoman Empire. There, so Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine, all administered by the British government. They set up a government there. You can see, did you ever wonder why all those lines are so straight in the Middle East? Well, that's because they were drawn in London with a pen, across a map, essentially, through local lines like the Kurds. I don't know if you've heard of the Kurds, like the Peshmerga, the Kurdish fighters. They're separated between Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq. So they're all sort of but if you were actually drawing a map, you'd probably draw them in, but because they were just drawing it in London, they didn't know that they were there, and they didn't know they were separating their territory between the two places. Also places like Kuwait that take a long time to sort of form outside of places like Iraq there. And then the French took Syria. The Syrians still speak a lot of French. They still have a lot of French within their culture, of course, which is now under 10 years of civil war, so not exactly the best vision of that. But these, of course, create, European-style governments in places that are very diverse and hard to understand. There were people who argued for a more nuanced approach, like T. Lawrence. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, but it's about a British man fighting in the Middle East during World War One against the Ottomans. Woodrow Wilson also wants to establish what he calls a League of Nations, of course, that the precursor to the United Nations. He said all these people need to join together to talk out their problems, to issue punishments for people who don't follow the international laws. Most of these countries are forced to join the League of Nations or encouraged to join the League of Nations. The only one, funny enough, that does not join the League of Nations is the United States. The United States says, oh, Congress has to pass the resolution joining the League of Nations, and the Woodrow Wilson didn't have the support in Congress to join. And so it was his idea, but the United States did not join until it became the United Nations after World War II. There. So I want you to look over that stuff. Make sure you've done the reading on these as well. Those primary sources, both Wilfred Owen and the Army form there. Make sure you respond to those. That writing assignment there. This isn't one of the. This isn't one of the optional ones. This is just a little response to what we would probably have talked about in class. If you have any questions, email me, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Have a good weekend and Thursday.